He came in dressed like an ordinary customer, ready to see how his restaurant truly operated. But when a nervous waitress slipped a folded note onto his plate, the words inside froze him in place. By the time he looked up, she had already walked away, completely unaware of what she'd just set in motion. The rain was relentless that evening, drumming against the windows and streaking the glass with glistening trails. As a man stepped quietly through the door of the restaurant, his coat was damp from the weather, his hair slightly tousled, yet he carried himself with the casual air of an ordinary customer. There was nothing about his plain clothes or unassuming demeanor to hint at the truth that he owned the very place he was walking into. The hostess greeted him with a polite smile, asking if it was his first visit. He returned her warmth with a nod, replying that it was, letting the lie slip out as naturally as if it were the truth. She guided him to a small table tucked away in the far corner of the dining room, a perfect vantage point for what he had come to do: observe. From here, he could see the entire floor, the bar, and the swinging kitchen doors without drawing attention. He sat down, adjusting his seat slightly so he could watch without appearing to stare. The atmosphere was dimly lit and softly humming with conversation, yet something about it didn't match the elegant reputation the restaurant claimed. He noticed the way some of the staff moved quickly, almost hurriedly, with a tense edge in their posture. Few of them wore cheerful smiles, but it was the kind of cheer that seemed painted on, stretched over something else they were trying to hide. Near the bar, a young busboy wiped glasses with unnecessary force, glancing toward the kitchen every few seconds as if expecting trouble. Even the air felt different while the rich scent of food still lingered. There was an undertone of something burned, something that didn't belong in a place that prided itself on perfection. It wasn't long before a waitress approached his table. She was polite, her greeting soft and professional, but there was a tiredness in her eyes that told a quieter story. Her hair was neatly tied back, her uniform pressed, but her gaze flickered just for a moment toward the kitchen doors before returning to him. As she handed him the menu, he caught the faintest tremor in her fingers. A subtle shake she seemed to will away by tightening her grip. He murmured a thank you, opening the menu as she stood patiently nearby, but he was already more focused on her demeanor than the list of dishes. Somewhere across the room, he heard a murmur of voices, staff members speaking low and fast. But as soon as he glanced in their direction, the conversation cut off abruptly, replaced by the awkward clinking of cutlery and the shuffle of feet. The swinging doors to the kitchen pushed open briefly, revealing a flash of chaos inside. A head chef face flushed with anger, shouting at someone out of view. The door closed again, cutting off the sound, but the impression lingered. Something was wrong here. When the waitress returned, her hands were still not entirely steady. She asked gently if he was ready to order, and he decided to keep it simple. "A steak, medium rare," he said, "and just water, please." She nodded, jotting it down quickly, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was a question in hers, as though she were weighing whether she could say more. Then, just as quickly, she looked away as she moved toward the kitchen. He noticed her pausing at the edge of the pass-through window, glancing over her shoulder before speaking quietly to someone inside. She returned minutes later with a glass of water balanced carefully in her hand. Setting it down in front of him, she lowered her voice so only he could hear. "Please read this when no one is looking," she whispered, her words barely audible over the ambient hum of the dining room. In the same motion, she slid a folded napkin beneath the glass, the edges barely visible against the tabletop. She didn't wait for a response. Straightening up, she offered a neutral smile, as if nothing unusual had happened, and turned away to attend to another table. He sat still, his fingers brushing the cool condensation of the glass, the folded napkin, hidden just beneath. Around him, the clatter of silverware and low chatter of customers continued, as if the exchange had never occurred. But inside, his attention sharpened, every sense suddenly attuned to the space around him. He knew, without even reading it yet, that whatever message she had just slipped him was not something meant for ordinary customers. And judging by the careful way she had done it, he also knew one thing for certain: someone in this restaurant didn't want him to see it. He waited. unmoving, letting the minutes pass as he kept his gaze on the untouched glass of water. The folded napkin beneath it seemed to radiate a quiet weight, pulling his thoughts toward it again and again. Conversations ebbed and flowed around him. Plates clinked against tabletops. The soft hum of background music filled the air, but his focus remained on that small, hidden secret. Only when he was certain no one was watching did he slide the glass slightly to the side, his fingertips curling around the napkin. He unfolded it under the cover of the table, the paper crackling faintly in the dim light. The handwriting inside was rushed and uneven, as though written in a moment of panic. "If you can help, please. Things aren't safe here. We're being watched." Management is not what it seems. His pulse quickened instantly, each word striking deeper than the last. This was no simple workplace complaint. There was fear embedded in the ink, a desperate plea compressed into a few urgent lines. He leaned back slightly in his chair, forcing his breathing to remain calm as his eyes drifted across the room. His gaze flicked toward the ceiling corners, the light fixtures, the corners of the walls, scanning for the faint glint of cameras. If the note was true, it meant someone could be watching everything, even this very moment. He let his expression remain neutral, his hands resting casually on the table. Even as his mind worked through the implications at a rapid pace, the waitress did not return to his table right away. In fact, she seemed to avoid looking in his direction at all, her path winding carefully between other guests, delivering drinks, clearing plates, but never coming within arm's reach of him again. It was deliberate, and he knew we-keeping. Her distance would protect her from suspicion. Near the bar, two male employees stood close together, speaking in low, hurried voices. Every few seconds, one of them glanced toward the kitchen, then toward the dining room, scanning the customers. The other kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his shoulders tense. The kitchen doors suddenly slammed open, the sound cutting through the low din of the restaurant. He caught the muffled edge of a shout, the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakably anger, sharp and biting. The door swung shut again, sealing the chaos behind it. For a moment, the hum of conversation faltered, guests exchanging uneasy glances before returning to their meals. His heart was still beating faster than it should, and the napkin in his hand felt heavier now, as if it carried more than just ink, it carried responsibility. This was supposed to have been simple. He had planned to remain invisible for days, watching, taking mental notes, uncovering any cracks in the operation before revealing who he was, but the urgency of the message burned away that patience. If the waitress's words were true, if people here genuinely feared for their safety, then waiting might allow something worse to happen. Still, the possibilities churned in his mind. Was this about mistreatment by management? Was someone skimming money from the business? Or was it something darker, something that might reach beyond the restaurant's walls? A different server approached his table, carrying a small basket of bread and a dish of butter. She set it down gently, her smile polite but strained. Her eyes drifted to the napkin in his hand for the briefest moment, and in that instant, her composure cracked. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by a tightness in her jaw, as though she wanted to speak but knew she couldn't. He moved smoothly. Slipping the folded paper back into his jacket pocket before she could linger too long, she muttered a quickened joy and retreated toward another table. Her shoulders hunched slightly. His gaze shifted back toward the bar, to the pair of employees still murmuring in the corner. One of them caught sight of him and quickly looked away, turning his back as if the interaction had never happened. The air in the room felt heavier now. The comfortable hum of earlier replaced by an undercurrent of tension he could almost taste. He took a slow sip of water, his eyes scanning each staff member in turn, mapping their movements, their interactions, the small cues that hinted at alliances or fear. He considered leaving, taking the note with him, and returning with the means to address it from a position of absolute control, but there was no guarantee the same people would be here tomorrow. If something dangerous was happening, every hour mattered. His role as an observer had just shifted to that of a participant, whether he wanted it or not. Into resolve, he would find out the truth before he walked out those doors tonight. Whatever this was, it was unfolding right now, and the note in his pocket was the first thread. All he had to do was pull it and see what unraveled. The steak arrived on a white porcelain plate, its presentation immaculate, seared grill marks crossing perfectly over the surface. A small garnish of herbs resting beside it. But the first hint that something was off came the moment he cut into it. The heat that should have risen from the fresh cut was missing. It was warm, yes, but not the kind of warmth expected from a dish meant to be served fresh from the grill. He knew the reason without needing to ask. Some delay, likely caused by the chaos in the kitchen, had let it cool before it ever reached his table. The waitress set the plate down gently, her movements practiced, her expression carefully neutral. She gave a barely perceptible nod toward him, as though acknowledging the note he still carried in his pocket, and then turned away quickly, not letting her eyes linger on him for more than a second. He took his time with the first bite, chewing slowly while scanning the dining room. The sound of raised voices drew his attention to the other side of the restaurant, where the floor manager stood over a young busboy. The manager's voice was sharp enough to carry across the room, and the boy's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor as he clutched a stack of plates. Several customers nearby turned their heads, their meals momentarily forgotten, but the manager didn't seem to care about the scene he was creating. He gestured forcefully toward the kitchen, sending the boy stumbling away without another word. Near the window, a couple sat with half-finished plates in front of them. A tense exchange with a server had just ended, though the details were too low for him to catch. The woman shook her head, the man muttered something under his breath. Moments later they rose from their seats, leaving behind untouched food and an air of frustration. The server stood motionless for a moment after they left, her shoulders sagging as if the encounter had drained her completely. He kept his expression mild, as indifferent. Server approached his table to refill his water. Casually, he asked how long she had been working there. She hesitated, then gave a non-committal answer a while. Her voice was polite but guarded, and when he pressed lightly, asking if she enjoyed the job, her smile wavered. It's fine, she said, before excusing herself to attend to another table. That hesitation told him more than words could. In the next 20 minutes, through similar small exchanges, he learned the truth. Staff turnover was unusually high, with some employees leaving after only a few weeks. The reasons were never clearly stated, but the patterns spoke for themselves. His attention kept drifting to the floor manager. The man moved with a certain restless energy, vanishing into the back for long stretches and reappearing without explanation. Each time he returned, there was a shift in the atmosphere, a tightening among the staff, a sudden hush in conversations. At one point, the waitress passed by his table and let a small sugar packet fall onto the edge of the white tablecloth. It landed almost too casually, as though she had simply dropped it by mistake, but when he reached for it under the guise of adjusting his plate, he felt the faint stiffness of folded paper inside. He waited until she was well out of sight before tearing the packet open beneath the table. Inside was a tiny note, written in the same hurried scrawl as before. Do not trust the manager. That simple sentence deepened the shadows in his thoughts. He ate in slow, measured bites, his ears tuned to every murmur and footstep. Twice, he caught fragments of hushed conversation drifting from the back. They can't know, not yet, followed by the scrape of a chair and the sound of something heavy being set down. Each time, the voices stopped abruptly, replaced by the muted clang of dishes or the hiss of steam from the kitchen. His eyes moved to the far wall near the service hallway, where a single door bore the word storage in black lettering. Seemed ordinary enough at first glance, but what caught his attention was how no one approached it unless the floor manager was present. Staff would walk past it without even glancing in its direction, almost as if they had been instructed not to. And when the manager himself went through it once, he locked it behind him before disappearing inside. The pieces were stacking themselves into a picture he didn't like. This was no longer a matter of poor work culture or a few bad management choices. Something was happening here, something hidden, deliberate, and potentially criminal. The staff's fear was not about long hours or low pay. It was deeper, more insidious. And the fact that two separate notes had reached him tonight told him they were desperate for help. He set down his fork, appetite gone, and leaned back in his chair as though simply taking a break from his meal. In reality, his mind was moving quickly, weighing options. Leaving now and returning later with reinforcements was safer, but it risked losing the chance to see what was behind that locked door, or to catch the manager in whatever act was being concealed. The other path, the one pulling at him more strongly, was to confront the truth tonight, before anything could be hidden or erased. He glanced once more at the waitress across the room, her movements quick and precise, but her eyes betraying a constant, subtle vigilance. She was waiting for something from him, maybe even counting on it. He decided he would not leave without answers. Tonight, whatever was behind that locked door, whatever the manager didn't want anyone to see, he would see it for himself. The waitress passed his table with a tray of drinks balanced in her hands, her step steady, but her voice barely above. A whisper as she leaned slightly toward him. "We're watching the cameras now. If you're going to do something, do it soon." She didn't pause for an answer, moving on to another table as if nothing had been said. The words lodged in his mind like a spark catching dry tinder. Whatever was happening here was being monitored in real time, and if he hesitated, the chance to expose it could vanish before the night was over. He raised his hand to signal for the bill, keeping his expression calm, almost indifferent, as though his only concern was settling the check. When the slip of paper arrived, he slid out the exact amount in cash, placing it neatly on the table. Before standing, he moved with a deliberate slowness, the kind that didn't draw suspicion, weaving between tables and heading toward the kitchen under the guise of thanking the chef. For his meal, the air in the back was different, hotter, heavier, and tinged with the scent of oil and sharp spices. Stainless steel counters gleamed under bright lights, and the clatter of pans echoed against tile walls. Near the far end of the room, the floor manager and the head chef stood locked in a heated argument, their voices sharp and rising above the kitchen noise. The chef's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, while the manager jabbed a finger toward him, his face flushed with frustration. Neither noticed the man at first. When they did, both froze mid-sentence, their eyes narrowing in suspicion. He closed the distance between them without hurry, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "I think it's time we had a conversation," he said, then paused, letting the tension settle before delivering the truth. "I own this restaurant." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, instant ripples of shock moving through the kitchen. The manager's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The chef's defiance evaporated, replaced by an uneasy stiffness. Around them, the staff who had been moving through their routines slowed and gathered, drawn by the change in atmosphere. He didn't raise his voice, but the steadiness in his tone left no room for argument. "I want to know exactly what has been happening here. I've seen the intimidation. I've seen the fear in my staff's eyes, and now I want answers." For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of something cooking on the stove. Then the waitress stepped forward. From the crowd, her shoulders squared now that the truth of his identity had given her room to speak. She explained what she and others had endured, how management had been overcharging customers and pocketing the difference, how certain suppliers were being cut in on the scam, and how anyone who dared question it was threatened with termination. Worse, she spoke of shifts deliberately made unbearable, so employees would quit before their pay could be processed, and of customers being lied to when they complained. Each detail tightened his jaw further, his hands resting on the counter as he listened. The staff around them shifted uneasily, some nodding in agreement, others looking down as if ashamed they hadn't spoken sooner. The manager tried to interrupt, sputtering something about misunderstandings and disgruntled employees. But the owner's gaze cut him off mid-sentence. "Enough," he said, the single word landing with the weight of finality. He turned to one of the senior staff members he trusted from previous visits. "Call security. They're leaving now." The manager's protest died before it could begin. The head chef, his earlier bluster gone, stood with arms crossed, staring at the floor as two uniformed security officers arrived and moved toward them. "You've abused your positions and your people," the owner said, looking between them. "You've damaged the reputation of this place, and you've done it under my roof. That ends tonight." With that, the two men were escorted out, their departure watched in silence by every pair of eyes in the room. When the door shut behind them, he turned back to the gathered staff. His voice softened slightly, though it still carried the firmness of leadership. Things will be different from this moment forward. No more fear, no more lies. You will be treated with respect, and you will be paid what you've earned. This is your workplace, but it should also be a place where you feel safe. The shift in the room was almost tangible. Shoulders straightened, guarded expressions eased. The quiet murmur of relief began to replace the silence. The waitress approached him then, her earlier caution replaced by a cautious gratitude. "I almost lost hope anyone would listen," she said quietly, her voice tinged with emotion. He met her gaze and replied, "You just saved this place, and everyone in it." There was no need for more words. The truth had been spoken, the rot cut away, and the space felt lighter for it. As he stepped back out into the dining room, the steady patter of rain against the windows greeted him once again. Outside, the night moved on, as if nothing had happened, but inside, everything had changed. And in the quiet that followed, the thought stayed with him. Sometimes the smallest cry for help can change everything.